June 3rd, 1856. Northern Texas. Just before dawn, along a stretch of mesquite and scrub oak near the Trinity River, 3 horses were found wandering without riders. Their reins were still tied. Saddlebags were intact. 1 rifle remained secured in its scabbard, but there were no men. By noon, a ranch hand following stray cattle discovered the first body. It lay partially concealed beneath a fallen cottonwood, boots still on, coat torn open, eyes fixed toward the tree line as if watching something approach in the final seconds. There were no gunshot wounds, no obvious knife injuries, only bruising along the jaw and rope burns around both wrists. Within 2 days, 2 more bodies were found. All 3 men had left town together 48 hours earlier. Their names were known across 3 counties. They were slave catchers. In 1856, Texas was still a young state, annexed barely a decade earlier. The institution of slavery was not only legal, but expanding. Plantation agriculture was spreading westward, and with it came a system of enforcement, formal and informal, that ensured enslaved men, women, and children who fled were pursued. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 strengthened that system across the United States. But in Texas, local enforcement often took a more direct shape. Private groups of men, sometimes deputized, sometimes not, made a business of tracking escapees. They were paid by plantation owners or by intermediaries who specialized in returns. The 3 men found dead near the Trinity were among those trackers. Elias Boone was 41. Born in Tennessee, he had come to Texas seeking land, but found profit in pursuit instead. County tax records list modest acreage. Court records show 2 prior disputes over payment for returned fugitives. Neighbors described him as disciplined, not prone to drink, methodical in the field. Caleb Turner, 36, had served briefly in a local militia. He was known for his skill with hounds. His wife, Sarah, had delivered their 3rd child in March. Letters preserved decades later by a descendant refer to him as steady-handed and practical. The youngest was Matthew Crow, 28, unmarried. He worked seasonally as a ranch hand, but joined expeditions for pay. He was described in one church ledger as restless. On May 31st, 1856, a plantation owner south of Dallas reported that 2 enslaved men were missing. Their names were recorded in the owner's ledger as Josiah and Ben. They had been assigned to field labor. According to testimony later given in a county inquiry, they were last seen near dusk, near the tree line bordering the river road. Boone assembled his small team quickly. Witnesses in the town of Birdville recalled seeing the 3 men depart just after sunrise on June 1st. They carried rifles, rope, provisions for several days, and Turner's hounds. They were said to be in confident spirits. One shopkeeper later told investigators that Boone remarked, "They won't make it past the river. That was the last verified sighting of the men alive. On June 2nd, residents along a northern trail reported hearing dogs howling in the distance. One farmer claimed he heard a single gunshot shortly after midnight. Another dismissed it as thunder. By June 3rd, the riderless horses had returned close to the edge of a grazing field, nearly 15 miles from the plantation where the escape had been reported. The first body was located approximately half a mile from where the horses were found. Local authorities were notified. In 1856 Texas, formal law enforcement was limited. The county sheriff and a small posse arrived by late afternoon. They documented what they could. Boone's body showed evidence of binding. His wrists bore deep impressions consistent with coarse rope. His ankles showed similar marks. There were abrasions on his cheekbone and temple. No bullet wounds were found. His rifle lay 10 feet away, unfired. Turner was discovered 2 miles east, partially submerged in a shallow creek. He had a fractured forearm and blunt trauma to the back of the skull. His boots were missing. His dogs were not found. Crow was located last, nearly a full day later. He lay near a ridge overlooking the river. His throat bore a narrow incision, shallow but precise. Not enough to fully sever the artery, but enough to bleed significantly. There were signs of struggle in the dirt, multiple sets of footprints, difficult to distinguish in the dry soil. The sheriff's initial conclusion was straightforward. The men had caught up to their quarry and were overpowered, but that raised immediate questions. 2 enslaved men, likely exhausted, unarmed according to plantation inventory, had managed to subdue 3 armed trackers with experience in pursuit. There were no signs that Boone or Turner had fired their weapons. Powder residue was absent from the barrels. The rifles were loaded. Investigators retraced what they believed to be the path of travel. Dog tracks were found near the southern trail, but vanished near the riverbank. No canine bodies were located. Rope fibers found on Boone's wrists were examined. They did not match the rope carried in Boone's saddlebag. The fibers were thicker, darker, possibly cut from farm harness or wagon binding. In town, rumors began almost immediately. Some claimed the 2 escapees had help. Northern Texas, in 1856, was not isolated from broader tensions. Though Texas was a slave state, there were pockets of settlers from the Midwest and border states who opposed the institution privately. A few small anti-slavery sympathizers were rumored to operate informal networks guiding fugitives westward toward native territories, where jurisdiction was fragmented and enforcement inconsistent. However, no documented underground railroad structure comparable to northern states existed openly in Texas at that time. Still, investigators considered the possibility of assistance. On June 6th, a small camp was discovered roughly 5 miles upriver. Ash from a recent fire was found. 2 tin cups, cornbread remnants, and what appeared to be a fragment of cloth torn from a work shirt, consistent with plantation-issued garments. There were also boot prints, larger than expected for Josiah or Ben, based on plantation records describing them as of medium build. The sheriff questioned nearby homesteaders. Most denied seeing anything. One farmer, an older man named Thomas Avery, admitted that 3 strangers had passed near his fence line late on June 1st. He could not confirm their identities. He described them only as moving fast and keeping low. When asked if any were white men, he hesitated. He later revised his statement, claiming uncertainty. The plantation owner pressed aggressively for swift conclusions. He demanded patrols be expanded. Notices were circulated offering rewards, not only for the return of Josiah and Ben, but for information about those aiding and abetting insurrection. The term was deliberate. The fear beneath the investigation was not merely escape, but organized resistance. On June 10th, nearly a week after the bodies were found, a development shifted the narrative. A trader traveling west toward Fort Worth reported encountering 2 men matching Josiah and Ben's descriptions, approximately 20 miles beyond the initial search perimeter. They were not alone. He described 5 men traveling together, 2 black men and 3 white men, armed, carrying provisions. The trader claimed they avoided conversation, but did not appear in flight. When pressed later, he stated that one of the white men wore a broad-brimmed hat and carried a rifle of northern manufacture. The report could not be fully verified. No official pursuit beyond the initial search radius succeeded. The bodies of Boone, Turner, and Crow were buried in their respective family plots. Local sermons described them as men who died in the execution of lawful duty. Yet privately, unease lingered. Rope marks on Boone's wrists suggested captivity before death. Turner's skull fracture indicated force delivered from behind. Crow's neck wound implied deliberation rather than chaotic struggle. If 2 fugitives alone had acted, the sequence would have required coordination, strength, and opportunity, unlikely under direct pursuit. If assistance was present, it indicated organization. County records from late 1856 show increased patrol funding. Informal militias were expanded. Night watches became more common along river crossings, but no arrests were ever made in connection with the 3 deaths. Josiah and Ben were never officially recovered. In later decades, oral histories among freed communities in northern Texas would speak quietly of the summer the hunters did not return. The story was not written in court ledgers or formal archives, but it persisted in memory. There is no definitive documentation confirming whether organized abolitionist networks operated in that precise region at that time. There is no preserved testimony from Josiah or Ben. No signed confession. No recovered weapon definitively tied to the deaths. What remains are fragments. 3 experienced trackers left town confident. 3 bodies were found within days, disarmed, subdued, and in 2 cases bound. Evidence suggests more than 2 people were present during the fatal encounters. The landscape along the Trinity River has long since changed. Trails became roads. Fields became subdivisions. The cottonwood under which Boone was found no longer stands, but the case file remains. June 1856. 3 slave hunters entered the brush, believing they controlled the outcome. They did not return. Whether it was desperation, coordinated resistance, outside intervention, or a combination of all 3, the balance of power shifted briefly in a quiet stretch of Texas wilderness. And for a moment in that summer, those who hunted became the hunted. The full truth was never formally recorded. Only the silence remained. The official inquest concluded in less than 2 hours. No jury was impaneled beyond the standard county requirement. No forensic science existed to refine conclusions. Statements were taken by candlelight, summarized in careful script, and bound into a ledger that would spend decades collecting dust in a courthouse cabinet. The verdict was concise. Deaths caused by violent encounter while in lawful pursuit. No names were attached as responsible. No additional suspects were listed. The language closed the matter publicly. But privately, the investigation did not end. Within days of the burial, Sheriff Daniel Hargrove began quiet interviews beyond the formal record. Hargrove was not known as a political man. He had served in the Mexican-American War and carried himself with a soldier's restraint. His concern, according to later correspondence, was not ideological, it was practical. 3 armed men had been subdued and killed in territory considered secure. That suggested organization. He began with the most immediate question. How had Boone been bound? The rope fibers taken from Boone's wrists were compared against local stock. Ranches in the area used hemp and rawhide, but the fibers recovered were darker, heavily tarred, commonly used on river barges and freight wagons transporting goods northward. Hargrove rode to the nearest ferry crossing and questioned the operator. The ferryman recalled seeing no slave catchers, but he did remember a wagon crossing 2 nights before the bodies were found. It traveled after dusk, which was unusual. It carried 3 white men and what appeared to be sacks or covered cargo in the back. The ferryman could not confirm whether anyone else was concealed beneath the canvas. He described one of the men as soft-spoken, not local. When asked why he had not mentioned this earlier, the ferryman stated simply that no one had asked about wagons. Hargrove documented the statement privately. Meanwhile, tensions in Birdville escalated. Turner's widow, Sarah, publicly demanded justice. At a Sunday gathering she stated that her husband had been ambushed by conspirators. Her language reflected the broader fear spreading across northern Texas in 1856. That abolitionist influence from northern states was creeping southward, quietly, deliberately. Texas newspapers of the period occasionally referenced abolitionist literature found in other southern states, though documented distribution within Texas was sparse. Still, the idea of coordinated assistance took hold quickly in the absence of visible fugitives. The plantation owner, whose enslaved men had fled, Jonathan Pierce, escalated his response. He funded additional patrols at his own expense and hired 4 more trackers from a neighboring county. He also issued printed notices offering a substantial reward for information, leading to the identification of anyone harboring or aiding escaped property. The wording again was deliberate, yet weeks passed without result. Then, on June 18th, nearly 3 weeks after Boone's party departed, a development occurred that complicated the narrative further. A rancher traveling east from the frontier settlements near the Red River reported discovering a shallow grave along a wooded ridge. The grave appeared recently disturbed. Inside, he found the remains of 2 dogs. The animals were identified by distinctive markings as Turner's hounds. Both dogs had been killed cleanly. No signs of prolonged suffering. A single precise wound each. The rancher rode immediately to inform authorities. Sheriff Hargrove examined the site himself. The dogs were buried with care. The grave was dug deliberately, not hastily concealed. This detail troubled him. If the fugitives had killed the dogs in panic, burial would have been unlikely. If outside assistance was present, the burial suggested calculation rather than chaos. It also suggested time, the encounter that ended the 3 slave catchers. Lives may not have been a sudden reversal. It may have unfolded over hours, perhaps longer. Hargrove expanded the search perimeter westward. In early July, a farm boy gathering wood near a tributary creek reported finding scraps of cloth and a broken rifle stock partially burned in a fire pit. The metal barrel was missing. The wood appeared consistent with the type carried by Crow. The discovery raised new possibilities. If Crow's rifle had been dismantled and burned, it suggested an effort to remove identifiable equipment. But why burn the stock and keep the barrel? Metal could be repurposed. The theory that the fugitives were alone became increasingly strained. 2 men fleeing on foot would prioritize speed. Dismantling rifles, burying dogs, and binding captors required security and assistance. Yet no formal evidence of a larger group surfaced publicly. By mid-July, whispers began circulating in Black communities along the northern Texas frontier. Later oral histories, collected in the early 20th century during the Works Progress administration, interviews with formerly enslaved individuals referenced stories of organized resistance in isolated instances. While no direct documentation links those accounts to this specific event, some narratives describe groups of enslaved men who, when pursued, coordinated ambushes using terrain familiarity. One fragment, recorded decades later, told of men who turned the ropes back on those who carried them. The description aligns loosely with Boone's bindings. Still, historians caution against direct correlation without documentation. What is documented is this. On July 9th, a trader in Indian Territory, north of the Red River, recorded in his ledger a sale of provisions to 5 travelers. The note described 2 as colored men, quiet, watchful, and 3 as white companions. The entry is brief. No names are listed, but the date aligns closely with the timeline of disappearance. Indian Territory in 1856 was a complex jurisdictional landscape. Certain native nations held enslaved people themselves. Others maintained looser enforcement of fugitive laws, particularly when enforcement threatened local stability. If Josiah and Ben reached that territory with assistance, recovery would have become significantly more difficult. Sheriff Hargrove traveled north once more, but found no official cooperation beyond polite denials. By late summer, the investigation effectively stalled. Privately, Hargrove wrote in a letter to a colleague that the matter has roots deeper than 3 graves. He did not elaborate. In Birdville, daily life resumed its rhythm outwardly. Fields required tending. Markets reopened. Church gatherings continued. But something subtle had shifted. Slave patrols rode in larger groups now. They avoided deep brush without reinforcement. Night searches diminished. Fear had changed direction. For decades prior, the assumption of superiority in pursuit had gone largely unchallenged in that region. The deaths of Boone, Turner, and Crow introduced uncertainty. There is no surviving record indicating that Jonathan Pierce ever recovered Josiah or Ben plantation ledgers from 1857 mark them as absent, presumed lost. Lost, the word suggests both economic and personal disruption. What became of the 5 men reported by the trader in Indian Territory remains unknown. No census record clearly identifies them in subsequent years under those circumstances. It is possible they changed names. It is possible they separated. It is possible the trader's account was mistaken. The absence of definitive proof left space for competing narratives. One version held that 2 desperate fugitives, cornered near the river, managed through surprise and terrain advantage to overwhelm their pursuers, take their weapons, and flee. Another suggested that a small but organized network of sympathizers operated quietly along wagon routes, prepared to intervene when pursuit intensified. A third theory, less documented but present in local lore, proposed that Boone's party was lured deliberately into an ambush planned days in advance. No surviving evidence conclusively supports any single theory. What remains certain is that 3 experienced men entered the Texas brush in early June 1856 with the expectation of control. Within 48 hours, all 3 were dead. The rope meant for capture left marks on the captor. The hounds trained to track were silenced and buried, and 2 names, Josiah and Ben, disappeared from official record, not as returned property, but as men who reached beyond it. By autumn, the land showed no visible trace of struggle. Grass regrew over disturbed soil. River currents carried away footprints. Fires reduced wood and cloth to ash. But in quiet conversations, in lowered voices after sundown, one detail persisted. For once, the hunters had felt what it meant to be hunted, and the wilderness had not answered to them. By the time autumn settled over northern Texas in 1856, the official narrative had hardened into something manageable. 3 men had died in the line of duty. 2 enslaved men had vanished. The frontier remained unpredictable, but beneath that surface, something less visible continued to move. Sheriff Daniel Hargrove did not close his private notes. He added to them. In late September, nearly 4 months after the initial pursuit, he rode alone to the stretch of river where Boone's body had been found. The water level had dropped. Summer heat had thinned the brush. Details once concealed were now exposed. He walked the ground slowly. What he noticed was not dramatic. It was the absence of chaos. Where Boone had been discovered, the surrounding vegetation showed signs of disturbance, consistent with restraint rather than a wild struggle. Broken twigs were concentrated in a tight radius. Soil was compressed in 2 distinct depressions, kneeling positions, possibly. If Boone had been overpowered suddenly by fugitives in panic, one might expect scattered movement, erratic signs of flight. Instead, the area suggested control. Further east, near where Turner's body had been pulled from the creek, Hargrove examined the embankment again. The slope was gradual. Turner had not fallen accidentally. The fracture at the back of his skull had likely rendered him unconscious before he entered the water. Crow's location remained the most troubling. The ridge overlooked a narrow crossing point along the river. From that vantage, one could see movement for nearly half a mile. Crow had been positioned where a lookout would stand. The shallow incision at his throat, never fully explained, had not been chaotic. It had been measured. Not a slashing motion in panic, but controlled pressure. Hargrove began to consider a possibility he had avoided placing into writing. What if Boone's party had not stumbled upon fugitives by chance? What if they had been observed first? The terrain along the Trinity was known well by enslaved laborers who cut timber, tended livestock, and hauled supplies. Knowledge of hidden crossings shallow banks, and concealed trails did not belong exclusively to white landowners. If Josiah and Ben had fled toward familiar ground, they may have selected it deliberately. And if assistance had been arranged in advance, the location of confrontation may not have been accidental. The sheriff returned to Birdville with no new arrests, no formal charges, but a shifting perspective. That winter, reports of subtle resistance increased across nearby counties. Tools went missing from barns. Supply wagons were found untethered at night. Once, a patrol's horses were discovered, turned loose miles from camp. No direct link connected these events to the June deaths. Yet plantation owners referenced the earlier case more frequently in private correspondence. Fear travels quietly in rural communities. It does not require public acknowledgement. In January of 1857, a letter arrived from a county clerk near the Red River. It referenced an unusual inquiry made by a white man asking about land parcels available under assumed names. The clerk described him as educated, with a northern accent. The man had asked whether small tracts could be purchased without extensive background disclosure. He did not complete a transaction. Hargrove read the letter twice before filing it among his personal papers. The suggestion of organized relocation beyond Texas borders remained speculative. But if outside sympathizers were involved, they would not remain indefinitely in one place. By early spring of 1857, the plantation owned by Jonathan Pierce recorded additional absences. 2 more enslaved men were listed as missing in March. Unlike the June incident, no immediate pursuit was launched by local volunteers. Pierce hired outside trackers from farther south. They refused to enter the same river territory without a group of at least 6. The psychological shift was measurable. Slave patrol rosters expanded in number, but shortened their patrol range. Night searches were confined to roads rather than deep woodland. Men who once rode confidently with 2 companions now insisted on larger formations. The perception of invulnerability had fractured. Meanwhile, among Black communities, enslaved and free, the June event began to take on a quieter significance. There were no public celebrations, no recorded proclamations, but patterns changed. Messages traveled more carefully between plantations. Work crews lingered slightly longer near tree lines. River crossings were observed with more attention. Resistance in the antebellum South often left few written traces. It survived in whispers, coded songs, shared knowledge of safe terrain. The deaths of Boone, Turner, and Crow did not dismantle the system of slavery in Texas. It would continue for nearly another decade until the Civil War and the eventual arrival of Union forces in 1865. Yet singular events can alter behavior without altering law. In May of 1857, almost a year after the manhunt, a traveling preacher passed through Birdville. His sermon, preserved in fragment by a local diarist, included a line that drew discomfort from some in attendance. He spoke of the illusion of dominion over every living soul, and warned that the wilderness answers only to justice. The comment was not explicitly tied to the June incident, but listeners understood the reference. By mid-1857, Sheriff Hargrove ceased active inquiry. Officially, the case had no viable suspects. Jurisdictional boundaries limited further pursuit into Indian territory. Resources were finite. Privately, he concluded something more complex than a spontaneous struggle had occurred. His final notation, dated August 1857, read, "Evidence suggests coordinated resistance. Extent unknown. Identities unconfirmed. Outcome irreversible." Those words remained buried in county archives for over a century. What happened to Josiah and Ben cannot be proven definitively. If the trader's ledger was accurate, they moved northward with armed escort. Whether those escorts were abolitionist sympathizers, independent opportunists, or frontier settlers, opposed quietly to slave patrol practices, remains uncertain. No bounty claim was ever paid. No bodies matching their description were recovered. No confession surfaced. The graves of Boone, Turner, and Crow remain in small family cemeteries, their markers weathered but intact. Inscribed dates confirm June 1856. The cause of death is not carved in stone. The Trinity River continues to flow past the sites where each man was found. Modern development has erased many physical traces. Roads cut through former woodland. Ranchland became fenced property lines, mapped with precision unimaginable in 1856. But the case persists in historical footnotes, not because it was the largest confrontation of its era, not because it altered legislation, but because it revealed a moment when certainty failed. 3 armed men entered the brush-believing pursuit, guaranteed control. Instead, they encountered opposition, prepared enough to reverse the balance. Whether that opposition consisted of 2 desperate men who refused capture, or a network quietly embedded along frontier routes, may never be conclusively determined. What is documented is restraint marks on a captor's wrists, a deliberate burial of tracking dogs, a dismantled rifle burned in a controlled fire, a trader's ledger nodding 5 travelers moving north, and a sudden contraction of confidence among those who once rode unquestioned. History often records the powerful in detail and the resistant in fragments. In June of 1856, the fragments spoke clearly enough. The manhunt ended. The hunters did not return, and somewhere beyond the reach of that riverbank, 2 names stepped out of the ledger and into silence. Years passed. The tension that followed the summer of 1856 did not erupt into open revolt, nor did it fade entirely. It settled into something quieter, an awareness that the frontier was not as controlled as it appeared on paper. By 1860, Texas stood on the brink of secession. Political arguments over slavery intensified, and patrol systems expanded again, this time with greater urgency. But among older residents of Birdville and the settlements along the Trinity River, the June manhunt was still referenced in lowered voices, not publicly, never formally, but remembered. When the Civil War began in 1861, many of the younger men who had once volunteered for slave patrols left to join Confederate regiments. The war drained manpower from local enforcement networks. Enslaved people across Texas observed these changes closely. Movements became more deliberate. Communication routes shifted subtly. No official document connects the deaths of Boone, Turner, and Crow to later wartime escapes. But the psychological effect of that earlier reversal lingered. The knowledge that armed pursuers could be overcome under certain conditions remained part of the region's unspoken history. In 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston and issued General Order No. 3, announcing the end of slavery in Texas, many formerly enslaved people began leaving plantations almost immediately. Some moved north. Some moved west. Some remained and negotiated labor contracts under new terms. There is no record confirming whether Josiah or Ben lived to hear that announcement. If they survived beyond 1856, they would have witnessed the Civil War from somewhere beyond the Trinity River, perhaps in Indian Territory, perhaps farther north, perhaps under different names entirely. Sheriff Daniel Hargrove did not live to see the war's end. He died in 1863 from illness, according to county records. His personal papers were stored by a nephew and eventually donated to the courthouse decades later. Among them was the brief notation referencing coordinated resistance. It attracted little attention at the time. In the early 20th century, when regional historians began compiling county histories, the June 1856 incident appeared as a short paragraph. 3 men lost while pursuing runaway slaves. No elaboration. No analysis. The language softened what the physical evidence once suggested, but oral histories preserved more texture. In the 1930s, during interviews conducted with elderly formerly enslaved individuals, a few accounts referenced the time when trackers disappeared by the river. The names Boone, Turner, and Crow were not always remembered clearly, but the reversal was. One interviewee described it simply. They thought the woods belonged to them. No documents confirm whether assistance came from organized abolitionists, sympathetic settlers, or spontaneous alliance. No marked grave exists for Josiah or Ben. No census lists them definitively under new identities. The Trinity River still runs through northern Texas. Floods have reshaped its banks countless times since 1856. Trees have fallen and regrown. Trails have become paved roads. The precise locations where each body was found are no longer easily identifiable. Yet the pattern remains recorded in fragments that survived. 3 armed pursuers, rope marks on their wrists, dogs buried with care, weapons dismantled and removed, and a traitor's ledger noting 5 men traveling north. The final truth may never be reconstructed fully. Too many records were never written. Too many participants had reason to remain silent. But the outcome itself requires no embellishment. In early June of 1856, along a quiet stretch of Texas wilderness, a manhunt reversed direction. The men who set out to capture did not return. The 2 they pursued were never officially recovered. History preserved the graves of the hunters. It did not preserve the path of those who escaped. What remains is not legend. It is a documented disruption in a system built on certainty. For a brief moment in that summer, the structure of pursuit fractured. Control shifted, and the wilderness answered differently than expected. After that, the records grow quiet. The land kept its silence, and the case was never reopened.